What if I told you that a man walked onto a stage to speak, a man who had built his name on stirring debate and igniting fiery conversations across America, and within less than an hour, he was gone? What if I told you that the crowd who came to hear his words instead heard gunfire? And what if I told you that the suspect accused of pulling the trigger left behind a trail so chilling, so undeniably linked to him, that the courtroom itself gasped when the evidence was read out loud? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. This is not fiction. This is not a dramatization. This is real. And it happened in the middle of an open-air event where thousands believed they were safe. Think about that for a second. Have you ever sat in a crowd, cheering, clapping, waving your phone in the air to record a speech, only to realize in one terrible instant that danger was closer than anyone imagined? That's what unfolded that day at Utah Valley University. Charlie Kirk, 31 years old, a right-wing activist known for his unapologetic words and polarizing presence, stepped into that spotlight. He was speaking on behalf of Turning Point USA, the organization he co-founded, and for him it was another rally, another chance to inspire and challenge. But as the crowd leaned forward to listen, one man among them, or rather above them, had already made a decision that would silence Kirk forever. The very first seconds of that shooting tore through the silence in a way that still echoes today. Witnesses said the noise didn't sound real at first. Some thought it was fireworks, others thought it was a prank. But then the screaming began. Imagine hundreds of voices rising in confusion, fear, and raw disbelief. People ducked, people ran, others froze in place, clutching strangers' arms, unable to process what was happening. And in the middle of all that chaos, a man lay on the ground. Charlie Kirk, his voice silenced before his speech could even truly begin. But here's the question that haunts us all. Why? Why would a 22-year-old named Tyler Robinson take a weapon into a public event and into life in cold blood? And perhaps more importantly, how did investigators move from panic to certainty so quickly? Because within days, evidence surfaced, DNA, physical objects, forensic proof, that left no doubt about the identity of the shooter. Let's rewind to the investigation. The police did not only scour the ground for shell casings and bullet fragments. They looked up, and that's where they found the first clue, a screwdriver, oddly placed on the rooftop. What was it doing there? Was it dropped in a rush? Was it used to assemble or dismantle something? Questions swirled. And yet, when investigators swabbed it, the DNA screamed the name they were already starting to suspect, Tyler Robinson. But that wasn't all. Nearby, wrapped around the weapon believed to have been used, was something ordinary, a dark-colored towel, harmless in any other context. But this towel carried more than dust and sweat. It carried DNA, a biological fingerprint that tied Robinson directly to the crime scene. Think about that. In a world where people argue endlessly about politics, where opinions clash louder than ever, this wasn't an argument. This wasn't a debate. It was cold, calculated violence. And it left behind clues that science could not ignore. Now pause with me for a moment. Imagine you are sitting in your living room, watching the evening news. You see the footage, police cars, flashing lights, students crying, a stretcher being rolled into an ambulance. Then you hear the FBI director himself, Kash Patel, say the words, "The DNA hits from the towel and the screwdriver are positively processed for the suspect in custody." What runs through your mind? Relief that the suspect was caught? Or terror that someone so young, just 22 years old, could carry out something so brutal and not even speak a word about it afterward? Because that's exactly what happened. Robinson was taken into custody, but he refused to confess. He didn't shout slogans. He didn't rant about politics. He didn't apologize. He said nothing. Absolute silence. And in that silence, people began projecting their own fears, their own assumptions, their own explanations. The governor of Utah, Spencer Cox, made it clear Robinson wasn't cooperating. And that lack of cooperation only fueled the fire of speculation. Why wasn't he talking? Was it arrogance? Was it fear? Or was there something bigger behind this act? Something no one was yet ready to admit? But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. In Utah, aggravated murder isn't just another charge. It's not something that comes with a guaranteed sentence of life behind bars. No, it carries the possibility of the ultimate punishment, the death penalty. And in this case, prosecutors weren't shy about reminding everyone of that fact. Let me ask you, do you believe in the death penalty? Do you believe justice can be served when the state takes a life in exchange for a life? Or does that only create another cycle of silence, another tragedy added to the pile? These are not abstract questions anymore. These are the questions that define the fate of Tyler Robinson. Because when the court unveiled the reason for their sentence, it wasn't just about evidence. It wasn't just about DNA or eyewitnesses. It was about the motive, or rather, the chilling lack of one. Prosecutors laid out what they believed was the thought process of a young man who never should have been in that position. And when the words death sentence echoed through that courtroom, you could feel the air leave the room. Families sobbed. Reporters rushed out to file their headlines. America, once again, was forced to look itself in the mirror and ask, how did we get here? And here's the bitter irony. Charlie Kirk spent his life urging people to speak, to fight with words, to engage in debate, no matter how uncomfortable. And yet, his life ended not in a battle of ideas, but in a burst of gunfire. A man who prided himself on being a voice was silenced, and the man who silenced him now faces silence of his own, the silence of a prison cell, the silence of a courtroom's final judgment. But this is just the beginning. Because as much as the evidence ties Robinson to the crime, and as much as the death penalty sentence shocks us, there is still more beneath the surface. Was Robinson driven purely by politics? Was it something personal? Or was he part of something larger, something that investigators hinted at but never fully revealed? And here's where I leave you with the first cliffhanger. The shooting was tragic. The investigation was meticulous. The sentencing was historic. But what came next? The revelations about Robinson's background, his connections, and the secrets prosecutors uncovered would change everything. And no one saw it coming. The introduction ended with the cliffhanger. What if the man the crowd trusted to simply walk by them, blending in like any other college student, wasn't just carrying a weapon, but carrying years of untold baggage no one saw coming? What if the shooter, Tyler Robinson, wasn't merely a faceless name in a headline, but someone with a backstory so startling that even investigators, hardened by years of crime scenes, paused when they uncovered it? That's where this story begins to twist. Because the man who pulled the trigger didn't just act in the heat of a moment. He had left behind a breadcrumb trail of contradictions, quiet storms, and dark decisions that now, under the harsh lights of the courtroom, could no longer stay hidden. Picture it, the courtroom heavy with silence. The families sitting in rigid rows. Reporters leaning forward, pens scratching like thunder. Prosecutors standing tall, voices sharp, eyes fixed not on the crowd, but on the young man seated just feet away, head lowered, shoulders stiff. Tyler Robinson. He didn't look like a monster. He didn't look like a political assassin. He looked like any young man, confused, angry, distant. And maybe that's what made it all the more terrifying. Because if someone like him could carry out something like this, what does that say about the rest of us? The prosecutors started by painting a picture. Robinson wasn't some mastermind who planned for years. Nor was he an innocent caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was something else. He was both ordinary and dangerous. And that's a contradiction that should chill you. Ask yourself, how many people have you brushed past in your life? On a campus, in a mall, at a rally, without ever imagining what they might be carrying inside their minds? Robinson was one of those people. He blended in. He walked among students, professors, activists, and strangers. He laughed with peers, studied textbooks, went to events. But behind that mask of normalcy was a storm no one wanted to admit was building. So what was uncovered? What made prosecutors so certain this wasn't random? Let's rewind to the hours after the shooting. Detectives moved fast. They didn't just pick up the obvious evidence, the weapon, the towel, the screwdriver. They went deeper. They searched Robinson's apartment. They searched his devices. And what they found told a story that was as fractured as it was disturbing. On his laptop, investigators uncovered search histories. Phrases typed late at night, over and over again. How to hide DNA evidence. Can a murder weapon be traced? Public figures speaking in Utah. And more chillingly, Charlie Kirk Utah Valley University event schedule. Let that sink in. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't random rage. This was deliberate. And yet, here comes the contradiction. People who knew Robinson described him as quiet, almost painfully shy. A neighbor said he barely made eye contact. A former classmate said he once helped her pick up books she dropped in the hallway. A professor recalled him as unremarkable, but polite. How does someone go from polite and unremarkable to carrying out one of the most publicized shootings in recent political history? That's what haunted the courtroom. That's what prosecutors hammered on. That's what jurors struggled to reconcile. And here's another layer. Robinson wasn't talking. He wasn't explaining. He wasn't defending. He sat in silence, letting the evidence speak louder than any words could. And in that silence, every contradiction became more pronounced. The defense tried to suggest instability. They hinted at mental health struggles, at isolation, at the pressures of being young in a polarized nation. They asked whether society had pushed Robinson into a corner. They asked whether politics had twisted him into a shadow of himself. But prosecutors snapped back with the DNA, with the searches, with the towel wrapped around the rifle. Because facts don't lie. Still, I need to ask you, would you feel safer if he had shouted his motives? Would the horror of this act be easier to stomach if he had scribbled some manifesto or posted a rant online? Or is it more terrifying that he didn't, that he left us with silence, leaving us to fill in the blanks with our worst fears? But here's where it takes an even stranger turn. Because just when the evidence seemed airtight, something unexpected happened in court. Prosecutors unveiled not just the DNA, not just the weapon, but a notebook. A battered, spiral-bound notebook found tucked under Robinson's mattress. Inside, pages of scattered thoughts, angry rants against public figures, sketches of rifles. But then, abruptly, mundane notes, grocery lists, to-do reminders, doodles of random symbols. The notebook was chaos. Disorganized, messy, unreadable at times. And it raised more questions than answers. Was this the mind of a cold-blooded killer meticulously planning his crime? Or was it the notebook of a confused young man spiraling out of control? That contradiction gnawed at everyone listening. It gnaws at us right now. Because what's more unsettling? That this act was carefully calculated, or that it might have been the outburst of someone unstable and unpredictable. The prosecutors leaned into the calculation angle. They argued that his Google searches proved intent. They pointed out the DNA-laden towel, the screwdriver on the roof, the rifle hidden in a bag. They connected every dot. But the defense asked the question no one wanted to hear. If this young man was spiraling, if he was unstable, if he was left to rot in silence, doesn't society share some of the blame? That question hung heavy in the air. Now, imagine being in that courtroom. Imagine being one of the jurors, listening to both sides. On one hand, the undeniable trail of evidence. On the other, the possibility of a young man consumed by forces bigger than himself. Which would you believe? Which would sway your decision? And while you're imagining that, think of the families. Charlie Kirk's family, hearing every detail, every piece of evidence, every reminder of what they had lost. Robinson's family, watching their son's name drag through headlines, his future slipping away minute by minute. Two families, worlds apart, yet both destroyed in the same courtroom. It's almost unbearable, isn't it? But here's where the cliffhanger comes. Because while the courtroom debated whether Robinson's act was cold-blooded or chaotic, the FBI quietly revealed something else. Something that had been kept under wraps until prosecutors chose to unveil it. And when they did, it wasn't just about Tyler Robinson anymore. It was about a wider web, a bigger stage, and a chilling possibility that this murder was never truly about just one man. What the FBI revealed next shook the entire courtroom, and it will shake you too. What if the screwdriver on the rooftop wasn't just an abandoned tool, but the key to unlocking a far darker story? What if that simple, everyday object, a piece of metal we normally associate with fixing things, was actually the smoking gun that proved beyond doubt who had planned to break everything apart that day? Because that's where investigators found themselves staring, not at a bloody weapon left out in the open, but at a silent piece of evidence hidden just out of reach, high above the crowd, as if it had been deliberately discarded in a rush. Think about that. A rooftop, a screwdriver, a towel wrapped around a rifle. At first glance, it looks like chaos, doesn't it? Like someone panicked and dropped their tools mid-crime. But as the FBI agents explained, chaos can be deceptive. Sometimes what looks messy is the very trail that points to precision. So let's zoom in on that rooftop. The day after the shooting, Investigators combed through the university grounds, turning over every object, sweeping every corner. Then one officer spotted it, a glint of metal in the afternoon sun. A screwdriver. Now ask yourself, what's a screwdriver doing up there? Was it used to pry open an access point? To secure something in place? Or had Robinson, in his frenzy, simply forgotten it? The lab didn't hesitate. Swabs were taken. The DNA test was run. And when the results came back, it was like a hammer crashing onto the courtroom table. Tyler Robinson's DNA was all over it. But that was only the beginning. Because the screwdriver led to the second piece of evidence. The towel. Investigators traced their steps down from the rooftop to the bushes along the edge of campus. There, half buried under leaves, they found it. A dark-colored towel, wrapped tightly around the weapon believed to have fired the fatal shots. Picture the scene. An FBI agent crouching down, carefully lifting the bundle, everyone holding their breath. And when the towel was unwrapped, the weight of the rifle gleamed under the crime scene lights. A rifle and a towel. A screwdriver on a rooftop. It almost sounds too sloppy, doesn't it? Too obvious. If this was premeditated, why leave such glaring evidence? Unless, of course, Robinson thought he was invisible. Have you ever noticed how people who commit shocking acts often make one tiny mistake that brings their entire plan crashing down? Robinson's mistake was DNA. Kash Patel, the FBI director himself, made the announcement on national television. His words weren't dressed up, they weren't softened. The DNA hits from the towel that was wrapped around the firearm and the DNA on the screwdriver are positively processed for the suspect in custody. Boom. That was it. A single sentence that shattered any lingering doubt. The evidence wasn't circumstantial. It wasn't speculative. It was scientific. But here's the twist that gnawed at everyone. If Robinson left behind such clear evidence, was he careless? Or was he confident? So confident he thought no one would dare connect the dots? Which scares you more, the idea of a clumsy shooter, or one so brazen he thought he couldn't be touched? The prosecutors leaned hard on this in court. They displayed the rifle, the towel, the screwdriver for the jury. Imagine sitting there, looking at those items. Imagine knowing those objects were there on the night one man died. They weren't abstract anymore. They weren't just words in a police report. They were right there, inches from the jurors' faces. And the irony? These were ordinary objects. A screwdriver you'd find in your garage. A towel you'd fold after a shower. But put them together with a rifle, and suddenly they told the story of a murder. Now, this is where things got even stranger. Because alongside the evidence, prosecutors revealed something about Robinson's preparation. He hadn't just brought a weapon. He had scouted the area days before. Security footage showed a man, hooded, walking along the rooftop, carrying a bag. At the time, it seemed like nothing. After the fact, it became damning. Doesn't that send a chill down your spine? That while students laughed and studied inside the university, a man was already laying the groundwork for an assassination above their heads. And here's a contradiction worth pausing on. Robinson's defense insisted he was unstable, impulsive, spiraling. Yet what the evidence showed was preparation, patience, calculation. How do you reconcile those two pictures? Was he a disorganized young man who broke under pressure? Or was he a predator who knew exactly what he was doing? Let me ask you directly, which version do you believe? Because that question wasn't just for the audience watching at home. It was the very question the jury had to wrestle with. Now, let's pull back from the courtroom for a moment and think about what this means for all of us. We live in a world where public rallies and open-air events are supposed to be places of free expression. But what happens when a rooftop becomes a sniper's nest? When everyday objects like a screwdriver and towel become the tools of murder? How safe are we really when anyone with enough determination can bypass the illusion of security? And yet, for all the fear this evidence stirred, it also brought clarity. The towel and the screwdriver weren't just pieces of evidence. They were anchors. They made it impossible for the defense to argue this was mistaken identity or random coincidence. Still, silence lingered. Because Robinson didn't speak. He didn't react when the evidence was displayed. He didn't flinch when Patel's testimony was read. He sat there, stone-faced, as though he were watching a movie about someone else's life. And that silence drove the families mad. Charlie Kirk's supporters demanded answers. Reporters begged for a statement. Utah's governor, Spencer Cox, went on television and called Robinson's refusal to cooperate an insult to justice. But Robinson remained mute. Do you see the contradiction again? The evidence screamed his guilt, but the man himself refused to say a word. And just when the prosecution seemed to have wrapped the case with a neat bow, something unexpected happened. The defense submitted a sealed request. They wanted to introduce a new piece of context. Something about Robinson's connections. Something about why he might have been at Utah Valley University that day in the first place. And when the judge granted that request, jaws dropped. Because what came next wasn't about a screwdriver or a towel. It was about the possibility that Robinson wasn't acting entirely alone. That's where the story cracks open into something bigger, something wider, something scarier. Because if Tyler Robinson wasn't acting by himself, then the murder of Charlie Kirk wasn't just the work of a lone gunman. It could have been something else altogether. What if the towel wasn't just fabric, but the final nail in the coffin? What if something so ordinary, something you'd grab after a shower or toss over your shoulder at the gym, ended up being the damning piece of evidence that carried more weight than 1,000 courtroom testimonies? Because that's exactly what happened in the Charlie Kirk case. The rifle itself was deadly, yes. The screwdriver on the rooftop was suspicious, yes. But the towel? That's what turned speculation into certainty. That's what stripped away every last doubt about Tyler Robinson's role. Close your eyes for a moment and picture it. A dark-colored towel, crumpled and dirt-stained, pulled out from under leaves in the bushes along campus grounds. Investigators lifting it with gloved hands. The crowd of officers watching with the kind of tense silence you could cut with a knife. Then the slow, deliberate motion of unwrapping it, until the steel of the rifle gleamed under the floodlights. Let me ask you, doesn't that image haunt you? A weapon of death wrapped in something meant for comfort? It's almost poetic in a grim way. A contradiction staring us in the face. And yet, beyond the imagery, there was the science. Swabs of the towel revealed DNA. DNA doesn't lie. DNA doesn't get nervous on the stand. DNA doesn't change its story. It stays, it speaks, it convicts. And in this case, the DNA pointed directly to Robinson. But here's where things take a sharp twist. Because the towel didn't just prove possession. It suggested something deeper, planning. Robinson hadn't strolled into the rally waving a rifle. He'd wrapped it, hidden it, transported it with care. That's not an impulsive outburst. That's preparation. And isn't that more terrifying? Think about it. Would you feel safer if this had been a spur-of-the-moment act of madness? Or is it worse knowing he thought about it, carried it, concealed it, and waited for his moment? Which possibility chills you more? The prosecutors leaned hard on that narrative. They argued that the towel proved premeditation. That Robinson didn't just snap, he plotted. He planned. He intended. And the towel, stained with his DNA, told the story better than any witness could. But the defense? They tried to flip the script. They claimed the towel didn't prove sanity, but chaos. They suggested Robinson wasn't methodical at all, that he was panicked, irrational, spiraling. A young man in over his head, they said. A confused mind, not a cold-blooded killer. And suddenly the courtroom was locked in a battle of contradictions. On one side, cold, calculated preparation. On the other, reckless, unstable panic. Which side do you believe? The jurors leaned forward. The gallery murmured. Families clenched their fists. And Robinson? He stayed silent. Silent as always. Silent while his very future was dissected in front of him. But the towel carried one more surprise. Forensic experts revealed that along with Robinson's DNA, faint traces of another substance were present. Fibers. Not from the towel. Not from Robinson's clothes. Something foreign. Something still unidentified. And that sent the room into a tailspin. Because suddenly, the possibility emerged that Robinson hadn't acted alone. Had someone else handled the weapon? Had the towel passed through other hands? Was there another figure in the shadows, helping, watching, planning? Imagine being there in that moment. The jurors' eyes widening. The families gasping. Reporters scribbling like mad, already planning headlines. Because this revelation cracked the neat narrative wide open. It was no longer just about one man and his choices. It was about the possibility of a network, a web, a bigger plan. Do you see how the contradictions keep stacking? Evidence screams Robinson is guilty. Yet evidence also hints he might not have been the only one. And isn't that the most unsettling part? Because if there's someone else, someone who hasn't been caught, then what does that mean for the rest of us? The FBI didn't dismiss the fibers. They didn't brush it aside. They announced they were investigating further. But they stopped short of giving details. That silence, the silence of omission, hung over the courtroom like a storm cloud. Let me put this directly to you. Do you think Robinson acted alone? Or do you believe someone else was there, hiding in plain sight, letting him take the fall? Because here's where the cliffhanger strikes. The towel didn't just tie Robinson to the rifle. It opened the door to something bigger, something scarier, something that prosecutors hinted at but didn't fully reveal. And when they did finally reveal it, it wasn't just about Robinson anymore. It was about a chain of connections that linked him to places and people that no one expected. The towel was proof of guilt, but it was also proof of something more. And what came next in court would leave even seasoned investigators stunned. What if silence isn't weakness, but a weapon? What if the refusal to speak, the refusal to confess, the refusal to cooperate was Tyler Robinson's way of maintaining control long after the bullets were fired? Because when he was dragged into custody, when the flashing lights surrounded him and the cameras pressed in, people expected him to crack. They expected yelling, denial, some kind of political rant or twisted justification. But instead, he gave them nothing. Absolute silence. Think about how chilling that is. A man accused of murdering Charlie Kirk in broad daylight, sitting across from detectives, lips sealed, eyes down, body stiff. Hours turned to days, days into weeks, and not a single word of confession came out. Utah Governor Spencer Cox put it bluntly. Robinson was not cooperating. And that silence? It didn't make the world safer. It made it scarier. Because when killers talk, at least you know what they're thinking. When they don't, you're left with your darkest guesses. Now, let's step inside the interrogation room. Imagine the scene. A sterile table, a buzzing overhead light, two detectives leaning forward, their voices sharp but controlled. They slide photos across the table, the screwdriver, the towel, the rifle. They lay down reports of DNA matches. They play snippets of security footage showing a hooded figure. And Robinson just sits there. No blinking, no nodding, no words. Have you ever tried to have a conversation with someone who won't answer you? The silence becomes louder than words. That's what investigators faced. And it drove them to the edge of frustration. Because the silence forced everyone to project. Was he smug, confident, laughing at the system inside his head? Or was he broken, terrified, drowning in guilt but too paralyzed to admit it? Which would scare you more, the arrogant killer or the ghost-like one who refuses to show emotion? The courtroom was no different. When Robinson entered for his first appearance, the atmosphere was electric. Reporters shouted questions. Family members of the victims screamed at him. Flashbulbs popped. And Robinson? He stared straight ahead, lips sealed. The silence was deafening. But silence in a courtroom doesn't protect you from evidence. The prosecution rolled forward, presenting every forensic link, every witness statement, every shred of data. They didn't need his words. They had science. They had DNA. They had surveillance. And when Robinson's defense tried to frame his silence as proof of instability, prosecutors flipped it, calling it the arrogance of guilt. Doesn't that make you stop and think? Silence isn't neutral. It's a mirror, and everyone staring at it sees something different. Now, the irony cuts deeper here. Because while Robinson said nothing, others couldn't stop talking. Politicians debated the meaning of the crime. Commentators dissected every angle. Kirk's supporters called it a targeted assassination. Opponents whispered conspiracies about whether Kirk's own controversies had drawn fire. And through it all, Robinson sat mute, letting the world argue about him without adding a single word of his own. Let me ask you, if you were in his shoes, facing death penalty charges, evidence stacked against you, would you speak? Would you scream your innocence, or beg for mercy, or try to explain your side? Or would you stay silent, clinging to the idea that words couldn't save you now? But here's where the silence turned dangerous. Prosecutors revealed that during his intake at the county jail, Robinson had been offered multiple chances to speak, to explain, to ask questions, even to make phone calls. He refused. He wouldn't speak to guards, wouldn't speak to lawyers, wouldn't even speak to his own family. And when his parents finally broke their own silence, pleading through the media for him to say something, anything, Robinson ignored them too. That silence became its own form of confession. Because silence in the face of overwhelming evidence doesn't sound like innocence. It sounds like surrender. Still, not everyone agreed. The defense argued his refusal to speak was evidence of severe psychological distress, that he wasn't cold-blooded but broken, that the very act of shutting down was proof of mental instability. And in Utah, that raised the question, was Robinson competent to stand trial? The judge ordered evaluations. Psychologists met with him. But again, Robinson said almost nothing. The experts debated, was this stubbornness or psychosis? Was it arrogance or collapse? And once more, contradictions filled the room. But then came the turning point. Prosecutors, growing tired of the defense's narrative, pulled out their trump card, Robinson's internet history. Because while Robinson was silent in person, online he had been anything but. Searches for Kirk's event, searches about murder weapons, searches about DNA. The words Robinson refused to say in court were already screaming from his laptop. And the moment those were displayed for the jury, silence no longer looked like instability. It looked like guilt. Now here's the moment that truly rattled the gallery. As the evidence was laid out, one prosecutor turned, pointed directly at Robinson, and said, "He doesn't speak now because he already spoke when he planned this crime." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, scribbles of reporters' pens. And Robinson? Still silent. But silence couldn't shield him forever. Because the charges he faced weren't ordinary. This wasn't just homicide. It was aggravated murder. And in Utah, that meant one thing, the possibility of death. Think about that for a second. A 22-year-old man, barely out of college, now sitting in silence as the state prepared to argue not for decades behind bars, but for his very life. And here's where the cliffhanger lands. Because just when the courtroom had adjusted to his silence, just when people began to accept he might never speak, prosecutors dropped the bombshell. They weren't just going to pursue aggravated murder. They were going to push for the harshest possible sentence. The death penalty was officially on the table. And with that, the silence in the courtroom was replaced by something else, panic. What if justice doesn't just mean prison bars? What if in Utah, justice can mean the state itself taking a life in return for a life taken? That's the weight of aggravated murder. And that's the weight that suddenly crashed down on Tyler Robinson's shoulders. Because in Utah, aggravated murder is not just another charge you can haggle over in plea deals. It's the heaviest charge in the book. It carries the possibility of the ultimate punishment, the death penalty. And in Robinson's case, prosecutors weren't bluffing. They made it crystal clear they would pursue it. Stop and think about that for a moment. A 22-year-old, barely out of his teens, sitting stone-faced in a courtroom, and across from him a team of prosecutors telling the judge they wanted not just decades behind bars, but death itself as the sentence. How does that land on you? Does it feel like justice, or does it feel like crossing a line? Now, let's lay out the stakes. Utah's legal code lists aggravated murder as one of the only crimes punishable by execution, but it's not applied casually. It requires proof of certain aggravating factors: premeditation, multiple victims, killing during another felony, or targeting someone in a way that shocks the conscience. And prosecutors argued Robinson's crime checked those boxes. They said he planned it. They said he scouted the university. They said he carried the rifle wrapped in that towel, carried the screwdriver onto the rooftop, and made choices every step of the way. And worst of all, they said he targeted a public figure speaking in front of hundreds, putting every single person in that audience at risk. Think about that. If Robinson had missed, how many more could have died? That's why prosecutors leaned so hard on the aggravated part. It wasn't just murder, it was reckless endangerment of everyone present. And here's where the courtroom air grew heavier. Because when the death penalty comes into play, it's not just about guilt or innocence anymore. It's about morality, about politics, about conscience. Jurors aren't just asked, did he do it? They're asked, should he live? Have you ever thought about that? Would you feel comfortable deciding whether another human being lives or dies? As prosecutors laid out their intent to pursue the death penalty, Kirk's supporters in the courtroom nodded. Some even clapped before the judge silenced them. To them, it was justice. A life for a life. But Robinson's parents broke down in tears, shaking their heads, clutching one another as their son's fate was spelled out. And this is where the contradictions cut deep. Because the same courtroom that demanded answers about Robinson's silence now had to wrestle with its own silence. Was the state justified in pursuing death? Or was it just multiplying tragedy? Let's pull back for a second and look at history. Utah has a complicated legacy with the death penalty. Firing squads, controversial cases, long appeals. It's not something used often, but when it is, it makes headlines around the world. The last high-profile executions in Utah sparked debates that still rage today. And Robinson's case was now about to be added to that list. So the question became bigger than Robinson. It became a question about Utah itself. Prosecutors didn't just want to punish Robinson. They wanted to send a message that political violence, that targeting public figures, that using terror in a crowd would not be tolerated. Not in Utah, not anywhere. And to send that message, they were willing to push for the harshest possible sentence. But the defense fought back. They argued that Robinson was too young, too unstable, too fractured for execution. They pointed to his silence as proof of his broken mind. They begged for life without parole instead, saying death would not heal wounds, it would only deepen them. Which side would you choose? Justice or mercy? Because in that courtroom, every single person was forced to pick. The irony here is almost unbearable. Charlie Kirk spent his career sparking debate, fueling fiery arguments about politics, society, and morality. And now, even in death, his name sparked the fiercest debate of all, whether his killer should die too. The gallery seethed. Families argued with strangers in hushed tones. Journalists scribbled furiously, and jurors shifted in their seats, already sensing the gravity of what lay ahead. But here's the cliffhanger you didn't see coming. Just when it seemed like the case was locked into a battle over life and death, prosecutors unveiled something shocking. It wasn't just about Robinson's silence anymore. It wasn't just about his DNA or his planning. They hinted at a reason, a chilling motive, that had been hidden until that moment. And when the court finally heard it, it changed everything. What if the question everyone had been asking, why, was finally answered? What if the silence that Tyler Robinson had wrapped around himself like armor cracked, not through his own words, but through what investigators uncovered in the shadows of his life? Because up until this moment, we had evidence. We had DNA. We had the rifle. We had the towel. But we didn't have the motive. And without motive, the story felt unfinished. Prosecutors stood in the courtroom and made it clear, this wasn't random. This wasn't a stranger stumbling into the wrong event. This was targeted. And the reason, though shocking, was painfully simple and yet terrifyingly complicated. So let me ask you, why would a 22-year-old risk everything, his future, his freedom, his life, just to silence Charlie Kirk? The answer prosecutors unveiled sent waves through the courtroom. Robinson had been obsessed. Not in the way a fan obsesses over a celebrity. Not in the way an activist obsesses over a cause. His was an obsession born out of resentment, frustration, and anger that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. Investigators revealed online activity that showed Robinson had followed Charlie Kirk's speeches, his media appearances, his Turning Point USA rallies. But not with admiration. With hostility. His search history, his private messages, even notes scribbled in that battered notebook under his bed, all pointed to a fixation on Kirk as a symbol of everything he hated. Think about that for a second. He didn't know Kirk personally. They'd never exchanged words. And yet, in Robinson's mind, Kirk became the target, the face, the enemy. How many times do we see this? A public figure standing on a stage, not realizing that for someone in the audience, or lurking nearby, they represent far more than just words. And here's where the contradictions explode. On one hand, Robinson was described by those who knew him as quiet, reserved, even socially awkward. A young man who kept to himself, who didn't stand out. On the other hand, inside his private world, prosecutors argued, he was boiling, seething, fixating. His notebook contained lines scribbled over and over. They have to stop. He doesn't care about us. Public liars must fall. These weren't polished manifestos. They weren't coherent arguments. They were fragments. Jagged thoughts that looked less like ideology and more like obsession spiraling into violence. Do you see the danger here? Because it wasn't about one political stance or another. It wasn't about left or right. It was about a young man who took the face of a movement and convinced himself that ending that life would somehow end his frustration. And yet, even here, there was contradiction. Because prosecutors also revealed something unexpected. Robinson had no criminal record, no violent past, no gang ties. He wasn't on a watch list. He hadn't been flagged by any system. In the eyes of the law, up until that night, he was nobody. Isn't that the scariest part? That a nobody can become a somebody in the worst way imaginable, overnight? Let's bring it back to the courtroom. When prosecutors revealed this, you could feel the air shift. The families leaned in. Reporters scribbled harder. Jurors glanced at one another, their expressions tight. Because the motive made it real. The motive made it undeniable. Robinson hadn't just killed. He had chosen Charlie Kirk specifically. And yet, listen closely, there was more. Because within that same evidence, investigators uncovered not only hostility toward Kirk, but hostility toward others. Professors, politicians, media figures. His notebook listed names. Some crossed out. Some circled. Charlie Kirk wasn't the first name. He was just the first one Robinson reached. Now pause with me. Doesn't that change everything? Because it means this wasn't just about Charlie Kirk. It means Robinson could have struck at others. That he had thought about it. Planned for it. And that's when the FBI director's earlier words began to take on even heavier weight. Kash Patel had said the DNA linked Robinson to the towel and the screwdriver. But prosecutors added, Robinson's intent linked him to something even darker. A potential list, a broader plan. But here's where the cliffhanger digs its claws in. Because while prosecutors painted Robinson as a man obsessed with Kirk, the defense wasn't about to let that narrative stand unchallenged. They argued that what prosecutors called a list was just the scribbles of a troubled young man. That the motive wasn't ideological. That it wasn't political. That it was personal chaos mistaken for purpose. So the question hung heavy in the courtroom, and it still hangs heavy now. Was Tyler Robinson a calculated assassin who targeted Charlie Kirk as part of a larger vendetta? Or was he a broken young man spiraling into violence, with no real grasp of what he was doing? Because depending on which answer you believe, the meaning of this case shifts entirely. And just when the courtroom thought it had heard the worst, prosecutors unveiled one more piece of evidence, something Robinson had written just hours before the shooting. And when those words were read aloud, silence swept through the room like a wave. What if I told you that the darkest truths aren't found in weapons or DNA, but in words scrawled in the privacy of a notebook? What if the motive that had haunted investigators for days was hiding in plain sight, on a crumpled page written just hours before the trigger was pulled? Because when prosecutors read those words aloud in court, the entire room froze. Even the clicking of reporters' pens went silent. Picture it. A spiral notebook, worn down at the edges, ink smudged where a nervous hand pressed too hard. Robinson's handwriting wasn't neat, it wasn't careful. It was jagged, uneven, angry. The kind of writing you'd expect from someone who couldn't hold their thoughts in any longer. The words? They weren't a speech. They weren't a manifesto. They were fragments, half-sentences, broken ideas, but all pointing to the same thing. Tonight, they'll hear me. He has to stop. No more lies. The crowd will know. Simple, chilling, direct. Ask yourself, does that sound like the ramblings of a confused mind or the planning of a determined one? That's the contradiction that ripped through the courtroom. Because for weeks, the defense had clung to the idea that Robinson was unstable. They painted him as a troubled young man who spiraled, who snapped. But these words didn't look like snapping. They looked like intent, premeditation, a plan unfolding step by step. And yet, look closer. The same page contained grocery lists, random doodles, a reminder to call mom. Doesn't that strike you as odd? To mix the ordinary and the horrifying side by side? To jot down bread and milk in the same space as the decision to take a man's life? It's unsettling because it reminds us that killers don't always live in separate worlds. They live in ours. They buy groceries. They call their families. They write reminders next to their darkest intentions. And maybe that's what shook the jury most. The normal and the monstrous on the same page. Now, let's step back and consider Robinson himself. Up until that point, we knew him as the silent figure in the courtroom. The man who wouldn't confess, wouldn't explain, wouldn't beg. But this notebook gave him a voice, whether he liked it or not. And that voice was angry, fixated, determined. So let me ask you, does silence mean anything when your own handwriting shouts the truth? Prosecutors seized on it. They held up the notebook in front of the jury. They read those words again and again. They asked the jurors to imagine the state of mind of someone scribbling them just hours before showing up at Kirk's rally. And then they dropped the most damning line of all. These aren't the words of a broken mind. These are the words of a man who knew exactly what he was going to do. The defense scrambled. They brought in psychologists. They pointed to the chaos of the notebook, the crossed-out words, the strange doodles. They argued it was evidence of instability, of confusion, of someone incapable of forming a coherent plan. And maybe they were right. Maybe. But ask yourself, do you need a coherent manifesto to commit violence? Or is rage enough? The contradiction deepened. Was Robinson a mastermind or a mess? Was he an assassin or a confused boy? Jurors shifted uncomfortably. Because the truth wasn't neat. It never is. But here's where things took another shocking turn. Prosecutors revealed that Robinson had scribbled another name in the margins of that notebook. Not Kirk's. Someone else's. A second public figure. Not crossed out. Not explained. Just sitting there, like a shadow waiting to fall. Imagine the gasps in the courtroom. Because that changed the scope entirely. This wasn't just about one act of violence. It was the suggestion of more. And suddenly, the towel, the screwdriver, the DNA, the silence, they all pointed to something even bigger. Because if there was another name, another target, then Charlie Kirk wasn't the end. He was the beginning. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Who was the second name? Why wasn't it revealed to the public? Was the FBI chasing another suspect? Or was Robinson alone in his fixation? Prosecutors refused to say more. They said the investigation was ongoing. That alone was enough to freeze the room. Let me ask you directly. If you heard there was another name, wouldn't you want to know who? Wouldn't you wonder if they were still in danger? Wouldn't you wonder if Robinson had help? Because here's the cliffhanger. The notebook gave us answers. But it also opened new questions. And the most chilling one of all. If Robinson had written down one name, how many more were there? What if the most terrifying evidence isn't found in a notebook or a search history, but in the silence of a courtroom when the physical proof is placed right in front of the jury? What if the moment the rifle itself was carried into that chamber, wrapped first in its evidence bag, then unsealed with deliberate care, you could feel the entire room inhale and never quite exhale again? Because that's what happened when prosecutors presented the weapon that ended Charlie Kirk's life. Imagine it. The bailiff carrying the bag, the sound of the plastic crinkling as he set it on the evidence table, the hush that fell as the prosecutor peeled it open, the metallic gleam catching the fluorescent lights. Not a photograph, not a diagram. The weapon itself, inches from the people deciding whether Robinson lived or died. Think about how heavy that must have felt, not just physically, but symbolically. Because in that rifle, you could see two lives, the one it ended and the one about to be judged. And then came the towel, laid out next to it, stained and worn. The screwdriver, scratched from use. These weren't abstract ideas anymore. They were real, tangible, undeniable. Prosecutors didn't waste words. They walked jurors through every fingerprint, every fiber, every microscopic speck of DNA that tied those items to Robinson. They explained how the rifle was purchased, how it was transported, how the towel contained traces from Robinson's apartment laundry. They even matched the screwdriver to a tool set found in his car, right down to a missing slot in the case. Ask yourself, how do you argue against that? The defense tried. They tried to sow doubt. They asked whether the towel could have been contaminated. They asked whether the screwdriver might have been touched by someone else. They pressed forensic experts on chain of custody, on lab conditions, on statistical margins of error. But the problem with scientific evidence is that it doesn't waver the way witnesses do. It doesn't misremember. It doesn't change its mind. And the jury could see that. Now here's where things cut deeper. Witnesses were brought in, students, faculty, members of the audience who had been at the rally. One after another, they described the moment the shots rang out. The sound, the panic, the screaming. One young woman said she still heard the echo of the gunfire in her sleep. Another said she dropped her phone as she ran and couldn't bring herself to pick up a new one for weeks. Doesn't it hit you how violence doesn't just take one life? It scars countless others? And then came the testimony that no one in the room was ready for. Kirk's longtime colleague and co-founder at Turning Point USA. His voice cracked as he described watching his friend collapse on the stage, the blood, the chaos, the desperate attempts to help. He looked directly at Robinson and asked, "Do you know what you've done? Do you understand what you took from us?" But Robinson said nothing. That silence, again, was louder than a scream. The jury sat rigid, their eyes darting between the evidence table and Robinson's face. The weight of the moment pressing heavier with every second. Here's the contradiction, though. For all the damning evidence, for all the emotional testimony, there was still that nagging question. Was Robinson in full control of himself? Was he cold and calculated, or broken and spiraling? The defense brought in psychologists to testify. They spoke about mental health struggles, about possible personality disorders, about the impact of isolation and obsession. They painted a picture of a young man consumed by demons he couldn't name. But prosecutors didn't flinch. They hammered home the point that broken people don't research DNA evidence. They don't scout rooftops. They don't write notes hours before declaring, "Tonight, they'll hear me." Doesn't that contradiction gnaw at you? Because both things can be true. A person can be broken and still dangerous. A person can be spiraling and still capable of deliberate planning. And in that tension, the jury's burden grew heavier. Then came the moment that broke the room. Kirk's mother took the stand. She didn't speak about politics. She didn't speak about rallies or movements. She spoke about her son, the boy who grew up debating at the dinner table, the man who called her every week no matter how busy he got, the son she would never hug again. Her voice cracked, her hands trembled, and her grief poured out in a way that words can't capture. And Robinson? He didn't look at her. The silence returned. And yet, as damning as that testimony was, as final as the evidence seemed, the defense wasn't finished. Because in their closing moments, they hinted at something no one had expected, an explanation that pointed not just at Robinson's mind, but at outside influences. And when those words hit the air, the courtroom froze. Because if Robinson wasn't alone in his planning, then the rifle, the towel, the screwdriver, everything was only part of a larger puzzle. And what came next would shift the focus away from Robinson himself and onto a shadowy question that no one wanted to ask. What if I told you that Utah hadn't seen a death penalty case ignite such controversy in decades? What if the very moment the judge uttered the words, "This court will proceed with sentencing under the aggravated murder statute," you could feel history being made, and not everyone agreed it was justice? Because Chapter 9 isn't just about Robinson's guilt. It's about the weight of the sentence, the final hammer, the ultimate price. Picture the courtroom. The air is thick. The evidence has been presented. The notebook, the rifle, the towel, the screwdriver, they're no longer abstract pieces of evidence, but symbols of a crime no one can erase. Witnesses have poured out their grief. Prosecutors have demanded the ultimate punishment. And now, everyone holds their breath as the judge begins to speak. Aggravated murder carries the possibility of death. Those words landed like a thunderclap. Kirk's supporters wept openly, some clutching one another in relief, others whispering justice. Robinson's family collapsed, tears soaking into their hands as they realized the boy they raised might not just lose his freedom, he might lose his life. And Robinson? Still silent, still stone-faced, a 22-year-old man staring into a future that had just been erased in one sentence. Now, here's where irony twists the knife. Charlie Kirk spent his entire career fighting in the arena of free speech. Words were his weapon. Debates were his battleground. He sparred with politicians, professors, and critics. He thrived in argument. And yet, his death created a courtroom where words couldn't save anyone. Not Robinson, not the defense, not even the pleas for mercy. Only judgment. Think about this contradiction. A nation that prides itself on freedom and second chances now deciding whether a young man should be denied even the chance to breathe. Is that justice? Or is it vengeance wearing the mask of law? Let me put the question directly to you. If someone killed a public figure in cold blood, would you want them to pay with their life? Or would life behind bars be punishment enough? The jury wrestled with that same question. And in Utah, where executions are rare but unforgettable, the decision carried extra weight. This wasn't just about Robinson. It was about precedent, about sending a message, about reminding the world that political violence would meet the harshest penalty possible. Prosecutors framed it that way. If we don't punish this crime with death, then what crime ever deserves it? A chilling line that stuck with the jurors long after it was spoken. But the defense countered with a plea for mercy. They showed photos of Robinson as a child. They spoke of his youth, his inexperience, his mental health struggles. They argued that killing him would not heal anyone. It would only create another grieving family. And the room split down the middle. You could feel it even in the gallery. Half the room nodding along with the prosecutors, their anger raw, their grief fueling their belief that death was the only answer. The other half shook their heads, believing no state should hold the power to decide life and death. Isn't it strange how one crime can fracture a room, a community, a state, when everyone agrees on the same fact, that a life was taken? But the judge wasn't finished. He reminded the room of the legal standard, the aggravating factors, the undeniable premeditation, the danger Robinson posed to not just Kirk, but everyone in that crowd, the risk of more names in that notebook, the possibility that this wasn't just about one man, but a mindset that could have spiraled into more bloodshed. And with that, he made it official. Robinson would face death. The words hung heavy. Death. Sentence. Final. Now here's the part no one saw coming. Outside the courthouse, protests erupted immediately. Some holding signs that read "Justice for Kirk." Others holding signs that read "Stop State Killing." Police had to set up barriers to keep the two groups apart. Voices clashed, not over whether Robinson was guilty, but over whether the punishment was right. And doesn't that say something about us? That even in a case with overwhelming evidence, with a nation watching, we still can't agree on what justice looks like. Inside, reporters rushed to file headlines. Tyler Robinson sentenced to death. Across the nation, the news hit like a bombshell. Some cheered, some recoiled, but everyone talked. And that's the cruel irony. In silencing Charlie Kirk, Robinson made his voice louder than ever. His name was everywhere. His death became a rallying cry, a political flashpoint, a national debate. But before the gavel fell and the session closed, the judge added one more line, one that hinted at the shadows still lurking in this case. He said, "The evidence points to preparation beyond this one act. The investigation into additional factors remains ongoing." And that was it. Case closed for now. But those words, additional factors, they cracked the story wide open again. Because if Robinson wasn't alone in his planning, if there were other hands in the shadows, then sentencing him to death wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Now here's where things cut deeper. Witnesses were brought in, students, faculty, members of the audience who had been at the rally. One after another, they described the moment the shots rang out. The sound, the panic, the screaming. One young woman said she still heard the echo of the gunfire in her sleep. Another said she dropped her phone as she ran and couldn't bring herself to pick up a new one for weeks. Doesn't it hit you how violence doesn't just take one life? It scars countless others? And then came the testimony that no one in the room was ready for. Kirk's longtime colleague and co-founder at Turning Point USA. His voice cracked as he described watching his friend collapse on the stage, the blood, the chaos, the desperate attempts to help. He looked directly at Robinson and asked, "Do you know what you've done? Do you understand what you took from us?" But Robinson said nothing. That silence, again, was louder than a scream. The jury sat rigid, their eyes darting between the evidence table and Robinson's face. The weight of the moment pressing heavier with every second. Here's the contradiction, though. For all the damning evidence, for all the emotional testimony, there was still that nagging question. Was Robinson in full control of himself? Was he cold and calculated, or broken and spiraling? The defense brought in psychologists to testify. They spoke about mental health struggles, about possible personality disorders, about the impact of isolation and obsession. They painted a picture of a young man consumed by demons he couldn't name. But prosecutors didn't flinch. They hammered home the point that broken people don't research DNA evidence. They don't scout rooftops. They don't write notes hours before declaring, "Tonight, they'll hear me." Doesn't that contradiction gnaw at you? Because both things can be true. A person can be broken and still dangerous. A person can be spiraling and still capable of deliberate planning. And in that tension, the jury's burden grew heavier. Then came the moment that broke the room. Kirk's mother took the stand. She didn't speak about politics. She didn't speak about rallies or movements. She spoke about her son, the boy who grew up debating at the dinner table, the man who called her every week no matter how busy he got, the son she would never hug again. Her voice cracked, her hands trembled, and her grief poured out in a way that words can't capture. And Robinson? He didn't look at her. The silence returned. And yet, As damning as that testimony was, as final as the evidence seemed, the defense wasn't finished. Because in their closing moments, they hinted at something no one had expected, an explanation that pointed not just at Robinson's mind, but at outside influences. And when those words hit the air, the courtroom froze. Because if Robinson wasn't alone in his planning, then the rifle, the towel, the screwdriver, everything was only part of a larger puzzle. And what came next would shift the focus away from Robinson himself and onto a shadowy question that no one wanted to ask. What if I told you that Utah hadn't seen a death penalty case ignite such controversy in decades? What if the very moment the judge uttered the words, "This court will proceed with sentencing under the aggravated murder statute," you could feel history being made, and not everyone agreed it was justice. Because Chapter 9 isn't just about Robinson's guilt. It's about the weight of the sentence, the final hammer, the ultimate price. Picture the courtroom. The air is thick. The evidence has been presented. The notebook, the rifle, the towel, the screwdriver, they're no longer abstract pieces of evidence, but symbols of a crime no one can erase. Witnesses have poured out their grief. Prosecutors have demanded the ultimate punishment. And now, everyone holds their breath as the judge begins to speak. Aggravated murder carries the possibility of death. Those words landed like a thunderclap. Kirk's supporters wept openly, some clutching one another in relief, others whispering justice. Robinson's family collapsed, tears soaking into their hands as they realized the boy they raised might not just lose his freedom, he might lose his life. And Robinson? Still silent, still stone-faced. A 22-year-old man staring into a future that had just been erased in one sentence. Now, here's where irony twists the knife. Charlie Kirk spent his entire career fighting in the arena of free speech. Words were his weapon. Debates were his battleground. He sparred with politicians, professors, and critics. He thrived in argument. And yet, his death created a courtroom where words couldn't save anyone. Not Robinson, not the defense, not even the pleas for mercy. Only judgment. Think about this contradiction. A nation that prides itself on freedom and second chances now deciding whether a young man should be denied even the chance to breathe. Is that justice? Or is it vengeance wearing the mask of law? Let me put the question directly to you. If someone killed a public figure in cold blood, would you want them to pay with their life? Or would life behind bars be punishment enough? The jury wrestled with that same question. And in Utah, where executions are rare but unforgettable, the decision carried extra weight. This wasn't just about Robinson. It was about precedent, about sending a message, about reminding the world that political violence would meet the harshest penalty possible. Prosecutors framed it that way. If we don't punish this crime with death, then what crime ever deserves it? A chilling line that stuck with the jurors long after it was spoken. But the defense countered with a plea for mercy. They showed photos of Robinson as a child. They spoke of his youth, his inexperience, his mental health struggles. They argued that killing him would not heal anyone. It would only create another grieving family. And the room split down the middle. You could feel it even in the gallery. Half the room nodding along with the prosecutors, their anger raw, their grief fueling their belief that death was the only answer. The other half shook their heads, believing no state should hold the power to decide life and death. Isn't it strange how one crime can fracture a room, a community, a state, when everyone agrees on the same fact, that a life was taken? But the judge wasn't finished. He reminded the room of the legal standard, the aggravating factors, the undeniable premeditation, the danger Robinson posed to not just Kirk, but everyone in that crowd, the risk of more names in that notebook, the possibility that this wasn't just about one man, but a mindset that could have spiraled into more bloodshed. And with that, he made it official. Robinson would face death. The words hung heavy. Death. Sentence. Final. Now here's the part no one saw coming. Outside the courthouse, protests erupted immediately. Some holding signs that read "Justice for Kirk." Others holding signs that read "Stop State Killing." Police had to set up barriers to keep the two groups apart. Voices clashed, not over whether Robinson was guilty, but over whether the punishment was right. And doesn't that say something about us? That even in a case with overwhelming evidence, with a nation watching, we still can't agree on what justice looks like. Inside, reporters rushed to file headlines. Tyler Robinson sentenced to death. Across the nation, the news hit like a bombshell. Some cheered, some recoiled, but everyone talked. And that's the cruel irony. In silencing Charlie Kirk, Robinson made his voice louder than ever. His name was everywhere. His death became a rallying cry, a political flashpoint, a national debate. But before the gavel fell and the session closed, the judge added one more line, one that hinted at the shadows still lurking in this case. He said, "The evidence points to preparation beyond this one act. The investigation into additional factors remains ongoing." And that was it. Case closed for now. But those words, additional factors, they cracked the story wide open again. Because